Melanie Carter was the kind of person who slipped through life quietly until the day her frozen body was found beneath a blanket of snow, and Darren Briggs, the ex-boyfriend she tried to escape, became the town's darkest question: was he a heartbroken man caught in a tragic accident, or had he led her into the cold, knowing she'd never come back? The cold wind swept through the pine trees as morning light crept over the mountains surrounding Fair Hollow. It was the kind of winter day that looked peaceful from the inside, a soft layer of untouched snow blanketing the earth, the sky washed in pale blue. Glenn Monroe, a retired forest ranger turned hobby photographer, had left his cabin early that morning, hoping to capture the frost-covered trees glistening in the sunrise. He chose the Elk Ridge Trail, a rarely used path on the outskirts of town. His boots crunched through the snow, the silence only broken by the occasional snap of a branch overhead. It was peaceful until he noticed something strange sticking out of a snowbank about 10 feet off the path. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree branch or a lost mitten. But something about it made him uneasy. He took a few careful steps closer, his breath visible in the freezing air. That's when he realized it was a hand. Pale, frozen, and unmoving, the fingers slightly curled. He stumbled back in shock, nearly dropping his camera. Within minutes, he was on his phone calling 911, barely able to get the words out. Police arrived swiftly, accompanied by crime scene investigators and a coroner. The small-town department wasn't used to this kind of call. They carefully cleared the snow, uncovering the rest of the body. It was a young woman, dressed in thin clothing not fit for the weather, a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. No coat, gloves, or bag. Her skin was icy, her eyes closed. The medical examiner confirmed she had been dead for at least 48 hours. No visible signs of trauma. Her ID and phone were missing, but someone recognized her almost immediately. It was Melanie Carter. A missing person report had been filed just 2 days earlier. The location of the body raised immediate questions. The trail wasn't well known, and in winter, it was nearly impossible to reach without effort. Melanie didn't drive and had no known connection to that part of town. There were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no tire tracks. The snow had continued falling lightly throughout the previous day, making it difficult to determine how she had gotten there or who had brought her. Investigators marked off the area and began searching the surroundings, but there was little to find. Just trees, snow, and silence. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Fair Hollow. The small community, where everyone knew each other, was shaken. Melanie was young, quiet, and by all accounts, kind. She worked at the bakery on Main Street and lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a convenience store. No one could understand why she had ended up dead in the woods, miles from anywhere she would normally go. As investigators zipped up the body bag and carried her out of the forest, more snow began to fall. It covered the path quickly, hiding the few footprints that remained. Whatever had happened out there was buried now, cold, quiet, and waiting to be uncovered. Melanie Carter's life had been unremarkable to most people in Fair Hollow. She kept to herself, worked quiet morning shifts at Brookstone Bakery, and rarely attended local events. She wasn't the kind of person to stir attention, and that made the details surrounding her death even more unsettling. As investigators began looking into her background, what they found was a life of routine with very few complications, or so it appeared. She had lived in Fair Hollow for the past 3 years, renting a modest apartment above a corner store on Pine Street. Her neighbors described her as polite but distant. She rarely had visitors, and when she did, they didn't stay long. The landlord mentioned that her rent was always paid on time, and there had never been any complaints. Her co-workers at the bakery echoed the same sentiment. Melanie was reliable, arrived early, and didn't talk much about her personal life. Detectives visited the bakery the day after her body was found. Her manager handed over her locker key, which contained nothing unusual, just a change of clothes, a worn paperback novel, and a few old pay stubs. The break room camera showed Melanie working her final shift 3 days before she went missing. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when police questioned Leah Wilkins, Melanie's only close friend, a different picture began to form. Leah told detectives that Melanie had seemed increasingly anxious in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She mentioned feeling watched, often checking over her shoulder when they walked together. Leah chalked it up to stress or seasonal depression, something common during the long Fairhollow winters. But she now regretted not taking it more seriously. Melanie had also mentioned an ex-boyfriend who had tried contacting her again. She never named him, but the tone in her voice made Leah uneasy. Digging into Melanie's records, police found a restraining order filed 6 months earlier against Darren Briggs, a local mechanic with a record of domestic disturbances. They had dated briefly the year before, but the relationship had ended badly. Melanie had accused him of showing up at her apartment uninvited and sending threatening messages. The order had recently expired. Just days before her death, investigators tracked Darren down at his workshop on the edge of town. He was cooperative but cold. He claimed he hadn't spoken to Melanie in months and seemed genuinely surprised to hear about her death. Still, his name was added to the list of persons of interest. Meanwhile, Melanie's phone and purse were still missing. Detectives checked local surveillance cameras, hoping for any trace of her movements that night. A nearby gas station had footage of her walking alone, just past 8 p.m., bundled in only her hoodie, heading in the direction of downtown. She didn't appear to be in a rush, but she kept her head down, never looking at the camera. It was the last confirmed sighting before she vanished. Each new detail only added to the mystery. Melanie had lived a quiet life, but in her final days, something had clearly changed. Someone or something had disturbed that quiet, and it had led her into the snow-covered woods where her story ended. The discovery of Melanie Carter's final moments on camera sent investigators down a narrow path, one filled with gaps and frustrating silence. After reviewing hours of footage from businesses and traffic cameras in the area, they found what they were looking for: Melanie getting into a black pickup truck just 15 minutes after she was last seen walking alone. The vehicle matched the description of a 2003 Ford F-150 owned by Darren Briggs, her former boyfriend. It pulled up alongside the curb near an alley behind the bakery, where there were no cameras directly facing. Melanie hesitated before getting in. She paused, looked over her shoulder, then climbed into the passenger seat. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. With this lead, detectives brought Darren back in for a formal interview. He initially denied seeing Melanie, repeating that they had not spoken since the restraining order had been issued. But when confronted with the video, his story changed. He admitted she had called him that night. He claimed she sounded upset and asked for a ride, saying she needed to clear her head. According to Darren, she asked to be driven to Elk Ridge Trail, saying she used to go there as a teenager to think. He said she asked to be dropped off and insisted on being left alone. Darren claimed he waited in the truck for a few minutes. But when she didn't return, he left. His version of events sounded convenient, too clean. Investigators pressed him, asking why he wouldn't wait longer in freezing temperatures or why he didn't try to stop her. Darren shrugged it off, saying Melanie was always stubborn and private. He said he didn't want to push her. There were no witnesses to confirm his story, no surveillance footage that extended into the wooded areas surrounding the trail. And with the snow continuing to fall during the night she vanished, all physical evidence, like footprints or tire tracks, had been wiped clean. Despite the lack of hard evidence, suspicion continued to grow around Darren. He had a reputation in Fairhollow. People described him as temperamental and volatile. A few locals mentioned loud arguments with Melanie during their relationship. One neighbor recalled hearing shouting from her apartment several times before the restraining order had been filed. Darren always denied wrongdoing, saying Melanie was exaggerating. Investigators searched his truck but found nothing directly tying him to a crime. No blood, no broken fibers, no signs of a struggle. The interior was clean, almost too clean, which raised more questions. His phone records showed that his location data had gaps during the time he claimed to be near Elk Ridge, possibly due to poor signal in the mountains. That made it harder to verify his timeline. Frustration began to mount. They had a potential suspect, a motive rooted in history, and a missing timeline, but no conclusive evidence. Melanie's cause of death remained undetermined. Without a weapon, a witness, or a confession, everything hinged on what happened during that short ride in Darren's truck. And Melanie was the only person who truly knew what happened next. Snow continued to fall in Fair Hollow as investigators pushed forward with the little they had. Weeks had passed since Melanie's body was found, and public pressure was building. Posters bearing her face still hung on light poles and store windows, now worn and fading. Everyone wanted answers, but the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. That changed one icy morning when a snowplow operator clearing a county road nearly 4 miles from the Elk Ridge Trail made an unexpected discovery: a shattered phone, partially frozen in a ditch. The phone was heavily damaged but still intact, enough to pull data. It was confirmed to be Melanie's. Detectives handed it over to forensic analysts who worked to extract everything they could. What they uncovered would alter the course of the entire case. Among the usual photos and text threads was a voice memo recorded on the night she disappeared. It had never been sent or shared, likely interrupted before she could forward it. In the recording, Melanie's voice was low and tense. She said she was scared, that Darren had picked her up after she messaged him in desperation. She said she regretted it immediately. She mentioned he was angry, accusing her of ruining his life with the restraining order. She said he wouldn't tell her where they were going. Her words were deliberate, not panicked, but there was fear behind them. The recording ended abruptly, as if she had quickly hidden the phone. Investigators now had more than suspicion. They had Melanie's own words, her final thoughts, recorded as evidence. With this, they secured a search warrant for Darren Briggs's home and property. The search began early in the morning, with officers combing through his garage, truck, and home. Nothing stood out at first, until they opened a locked storage shed behind the house. Inside, tucked behind boxes of old tools and broken furniture, they found a torn piece of a dark grey hoodie, the same kind Melanie was wearing the night she vanished. Further back, hidden in an old tackle box, was a wallet. It contained her driver's license and several cards, all belonging to Melanie. The items were bagged as evidence, and Darren was arrested that afternoon on suspicion of involvement in Melanie's death. News of his arrest swept through Fair Hollow like a winter storm. Many believed justice was finally being served, while others remained cautious, uncertain what exactly had taken place. During questioning, Darren didn't speak. He invoked his right to remain silent, offering no explanation for the items found or for the message on Melanie's phone. His attorney claimed the evidence was circumstantial and that Darren had no reason to harm her. The defense argued that if she died of exposure, it wasn't proof of a crime, it was a tragedy, not murder. The legal process began, but with the trial still ahead, the town was divided. The evidence pointed to Darren, yet the full truth remained elusive. How Melanie ended up alone in the woods, unprepared for the cold, and why no one helped her, still haunted everyone. Darren Briggs stood trial in early March, the courtroom packed with residents from Fair Hollow who had followed every twist in the case. Prosecutors built their argument on the evidence found at Darren's home, the piece of Melanie's hoodie, the wallet, and most importantly, the voice memo recovered from her phone. It was Melanie's own words, they argued, that painted the clearest picture. She feared Darren. She hadn't planned to go into the woods. She had trusted the wrong person. The prosecutor emphasized Darren's history, his controlling behavior, and a restraining order that had recently expired. They described how he had isolated Melanie, possibly manipulated her into getting in the truck that night. Then, once alone in the woods, he had abandoned her in freezing conditions without proper clothing or a way to contact anyone. Though the autopsy showed no physical injuries, the cold had been enough to kill her. The prosecution called it a cruel, an intentional act of negligence, leaving her to die, knowing she wouldn't survive, but the defense took a different approach. They argued there was no proof Darren forced Melanie out of the truck. They pointed to her messages to him that night, suggesting she had reached out voluntarily. They said she often walked to quiet places when overwhelmed and that Darren had honored her request to be left alone. The items in the shed, the defense claimed, could have been planted or left there by mistake from earlier visits. And most critically, they reminded the jury that Melanie had died from hypothermia, not violence, not assault. There was no definitive evidence Darren intended for her to die. A forensic expert testified that in extreme cold, disorientation was common. Victims often wandered off and shed clothing in the final stages, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. It was possible, they said, that Melanie had chosen to walk into the woods after Darren left, confused by the early effects of hypothermia. That possibility cast a shadow of doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Darren Briggs was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 9 years in prison. The decision stirred mixed emotions. Some believed justice had been served. He hadn't killed her with his hands, but he had left her to die. Others felt the sentence was too light, considering a young woman's life had ended in fear and cold. Melanie's family never spoke publicly about the verdict. Her mother was seen leaving court with silent tears in her eyes, holding a photograph of Melanie taken years earlier in warmer seasons when her smile still reached her eyes. After the trial, the snow began to melt in Fair Hollow. But the scars from that winter would remain. A memorial bench was placed near Elk Ridge, where Melanie had been found, overlooking the woods. No plaque, just her name, etched quietly in the wood. A reminder of a life that slipped away in silence and of the secrets the snow tried to hide.